I've noticed a trend in modern horror films in which the protagonist either becomes or is revealed to be a witch. This begins loosely with von Trier's Antichrist and continues through with films like The Witch, Gretel and Hansel, and perhaps culminates at its most perfect expression in Hagazussa, A Heathen's Curse. The story is told in visuals, so much so that it may be viewed without subtitles at the cost of almost no loss of detail or understanding. The combination of remote, beautiful settings and glorious vistas leaves little to be desired by way of gorgeous imagery, and the events of the story are readily grasped through the action. I should mention as an aside that the score is fantastic. Eerie and haunting, it suits both the setting and the tone of the story, and helps ensconce the viewer in its world from the beginning. The story is presented in 4 parts, the first of which is titled Shadow. It concerns Albrun and her mother, who appear to have a healthy, loving relationship despite their isolation. Indeed, we first meet them when her mother takes Albrun tobogganing. But there is a sense of something different about them, as they live apart from the others. They are met on the path by a man who warns them to get inside, as darkness will soon fall on 12th night. He warns them of Perchta's wrath, a heathen concern. In the night, they are harassed by townspeople, punished for being outsiders. They are heathens, shunned by Christian locals. But there's no evidence of anything untoward in the way they live. We do not see Albrun's mother impart upon her any witchcraft, or even any thoughts of malice against the townsfolk. It's only at the moment of her dying that the mother becomes vile and begins to exhibit grotesque behaviors. And then she departs to die alone in the bog, to protect her daughter from the corruption to which she has succumbed. So it isn't clear whether the change we see in her was a transformation or an unmasking. Was she, the serpent-bound corpse in the woods, a creature of evil, or a woman out of her mind at the coming of death? In the portion titled Horn, we see what Albrun's mother has taught her: survival. And years later, in adulthood, she toils alone in a difficult, rustic life. She has an infant child, whose origin we are not told, and this leaves open possibilities for our own particular prejudices. We see how she is treated as something less than human as she attempts to sell her goat's milk.
Geh zurück, da wo du herkommst. Deine verpestete Milch, die wieder keiner. Du grausige Hex, du.
Traditionally, witches are depicted as women shunned by society due to their odious proclivities, often ostracized or condemned for the practice of dark arts. It's for this reason that they are isolated, forced to live alone apart from the society of the pious. But here, we witness questionable piety holding Albrun in judgment not for her activities, but for her very isolation, her otherness.
Vor denen, die Gottes Licht nicht in ihren Herzen tragen. Vor den Juden. Und vor den Heiden.
These women weren't concubines of the devil, but innocents, living perhaps without Christianity, but also without malice towards others. We see no overt sign of her practicing dark arts or any inclination towards evil. She isn't isolated for being a witch. She becomes a witch because she has been isolated.
Doch den Glauben einer aufrechten Gemeinde zu stärken, braucht es eine strenge Bereinigung aller frevelhaften Dinge.
Hat mich gefreut.
When violated, her victimization is the worse for happening at the hands of those she thought perceived her humanity.
Ja. Bis bald.
And so their cruelty quashes her better inclinations, and cements her will to do harm in response. Alone in the midst of nature, she's become unfettered, both free of religious obligation and its guidance, independent of social constraints, and a victim of loneliness. Her relationship with the natural world is a distorted surrogate. In this sense, I was reminded of Black Narcissus, and in particular the fallen nun, Sister Ruth. In the absence of society, and through the influence of wild natural surroundings, she slowly becomes sensual and debauched. The scene in which Ruth rejects her vows takes that film to the depths of horror, even in the midst of idyllic, wild, natural surroundings, not despite them, but because of them. So it is with Albrun. And we see how she warms to the slightest hint of acceptance. Granted her humanity, she responds with feelings of friendship and loyalty.
Ich habe jetzt so einen schön gefunden, und man denkt, dass ich dann mitbringe. Dankeschön.
Albrun has not withdrawn from the world of men in order to be hidden, safe to pursue odious practices as a witch. Instead, she becomes a witch by virtue of being ostracized from the world of men.
If human nature is evil, then that goes as well for the nature
of the women. Female nature.
the nature of all the sisters. Women do not control their own bodies. Nature does. I have it in writing in my books.
The trend I've noticed is that in response to their persecution, witches in these modern films respond to accusations not by defending themselves as innocent, but rather they embrace the corruptions they are accused of.
I knew my path would reveal itself, and that all was required from me was to be brave and to trust myself.
They become witches in the satanic sense, indulging perverse worship of nature or the devil. They are defiantly witches in the sense that others fear them to be.
And I am brave. And I will trust myself.
I cannot write my name.
I will guide thy hand.
Rather than protesting their humanity, they become inhuman in the face of inhumane treatment. Instead of protesting they are not evil, they become evil. They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Here we see the fury of a woman persecuted.
Es ist ekelhaft wie Holle Fötz.
Albrun is raped, her livestock stolen and mutilated. In response to the cruelties against her, she douses a rat in the stream that feeds the villagers in a kind of ritual curse. She then cleanses herself and pays homage to the memory of the traditions of her mother. After the violation, after Horn, comes the portion titled Blood. Having been first ostracized and then victimized, Albrun presides over her revenge, observing the devastation of the plague, perhaps brought about by her curse. Whether this is actual witchcraft or a vague gesture on her part that allows her to take ownership of the devastation doesn't really matter. The point is she now sees herself as its cause. Whether there is real magic behind her curse or the plague would have spread regardless, she assigns that responsibility to herself, and in so doing she consigns herself to the identity of the malevolent witch. She rejects the alternative of victimhood, but there is further cost to becoming the witch they believe her to be. She indulges in psychotropic mushrooms, something she may have been taught or warned against by her mother. Thus, now identifying with the evil her mother was accused of representing, she returns to the bog. Witches are traditionally represented as antithetical to the virtues of motherhood, so Albrun nursing a babe at this point is counterintuitive. This must seem so to her as well on some level, as we see what she does with her child. At this point, there is no distinction between Albrun becoming a witch or simply suffering the effects of a mental breakdown exacerbated by mind-altering drugs. Whether she's enacting her mother's will or making choices out of despair, whether she's aware of what she's doing or not, the outcome feels inevitable. She is corrupted. She is evil. She is a witch. All of this is true in her experience, regardless of whether there are any actual magics involved. As we all know, witches don't drown. It's something to do with being made of wood. We see here in the confusion of submerged activity that the broken roots appear to be bleeding. In the portion titled Fire, the fall of Albrun is complete. A serpent coils about her, as in her corruption she shares her mother's fate. Sober now, she discovers the condition of her child, but she has embraced her corruption and attempts to indulge the perversity and evil her mother had come to represent. It doesn't seem as though Albrun was evil by nature. Instead, she was driven first into isolation, then tortured to a state of rage, and finally broken by the unendurable guilt she accepts as her own. Witches don't drown, as we've said. Instead, they burn, like martyrs. Once again, it isn't definitively conveyed whether Albrun's fate was the result of a transformation or simply an inevitable consequence of her odious nature. Are she and her mother being exposed, or were they driven to evil?
I beg thee, save my children.
Whereas the witch is imbued with the concept of original sin, Hagazussa seems to speak of a corruption imposed from without. Just as Swinda in her hypocrisy feared external influences, Albrun is a victim of Swinda's malice. And so Albrun, who began the film as an innocent, is transformed. She becomes the monster, the witch on the hill outside town that the locals rightly fear. For she is their creation, a product of their small-minded hatred, envy, and fear. They have dehumanized her to the point where she has become inhuman, the product of their persecution. This video is number 50 on our playlist. Thanks for watching. Please let me know what you're liking or not liking, how I can improve, and if there's a movie you'd like to see spotlighted in a future video.